Good afternoon to everyone who is joining us from near or afar. I'm Larry Diamond, Director of the Arab Reform and Democracy Program. In a moment, I'll turn over the program to our Associate Director, Hesham Salam, who will introduce our wonderful speaker for today. I do want to just say that for the next probably several months and maybe longer, this is the way we will be engaging our constituencies. And we regret that we can't welcome Sarah to the Stanford University campus. We'll reserve that honor and privilege for a future opportunity. But we're very grateful to us that she can join us virtually, and very grateful to all of you for joining us. We wish all of you who will be observing the month of Ramadan a peaceful and safe and restful month. And everyone else who's on this line, please stay safe and healthy, and as much as possible, try and limit your physical contact while we combat this awful pandemic and prepare to once again engage one another person to person, as well as in all the intellectual ways we've been doing. We certainly are not going to be deterred in the Arab Reform and Democracy Program or at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law from continuing with our programming. So I thank you for sticking with us, and Hesham, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Larry, and welcome and greetings from my quarantine to yours. Before I introduce our speaker today, Sarah Yerkes, I would like to take a moment to welcome members of our ARD and senatorial communities, including those we usually see in person at our seminars at Stanford, as well as those we don't normally engage with in person and who are able to join the webinar today. If there's any silver lining in this whole crisis, it's the fact that our community has grown larger and the breadth of our engagement is much wider. I would also like to thank our IT guru, Roger Winkleman, and the FSI leadership for making all these valuable resources available to us in order to be able to live stream our programs and keep up our intellectual exchange even during these difficult times. With that said, it is my wonderful pleasure to welcome Sarah Yerkes, who is a fellow in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where her research focuses on Tunisia's political, economic, and security developments, as well as state-society relations in the Middle East and North Africa. She has been a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution and an international affairs fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. She has taught at Georgetown University and the Elliott School at the George Washington University. She is a former member of the State Department's policy planning staff, where she focused on North Africa. She was also a foreign affairs officer in the State Department's Office of Israel and Palestinian Affairs. She served as a research analyst for the U.S. military's Joint Staff Strategic Plans and Policy Directorate at the Pentagon, advising the Joint Staff leadership on foreign policy and national security issues. She holds a PhD in government from Georgetown University. I'm going to hand it over to you, Sarah. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Larry and Hesham, for having me. It's great to be here, if only virtually. And I have to say the commute from Washington is much easier on Zoom than obviously flying. And I'll caveat everything that I think we all have to do this at this point to say that I have 2 little children. So if there are Zoom bombers, I apologize in advance, but hopefully they will leave me alone for at least the next 30 minutes. So I'm here to talk about democracy promotion in the Arab world from the United States perspective. And particularly this issue is important because democracy has been a long-standing goal of US foreign policy. And so today, what I want to look at is what this has looked like specifically in the MENA, Middle East, North Africa region, starting with George W. Bush, who was really the most recent serious champion of democracy in the Middle East through his freedom agenda, which I'll offer some thoughts on, a major initiative of his administration's foreign policy that started after the 9/11 attacks. I'm then going to turn to the Obama years, and President Obama came to office hoping to both repair relationships in the region and to disengage from the region simultaneously. And we'll talk about what that looked like But that all kind of got turned on its head when the Arab Spring happened. So I'll talk through a little bit about how the administration responded to the Arab Spring. And then finally turn to the Trump administration and what democracy promotion, or the lack thereof, looks like under an administration that came to power really promoting transactional foreign policy, an America First policy that had little room for values in that foreign policy. And then finally, I'm going to offer a couple of thoughts on what comes next, what we might expect to see going forward, given the situation that we're all in today, but also should there be a change in administration, maybe what that administration might prioritize and what that might look like. So let me start with the Bush years. Now, as I said, there has been really no greater democracy promoter in the White House in the recent decades than George W. Bush. His freedom agenda, which he set up as part of the response to the 9/11 terror attacks, sought to remake the Middle East into America's image. This came about after the horrific attacks of 9/11, where the administration, the Bush administration, was trying to figure out, how do you prevent this from happening again? How do you get at this, the root causes of this terror, and how do you stem this, kind of really try to make sure this doesn't come back to haunt the United States again. And one of the ways that the administration decided they would do this was through what they called changing hearts and minds. And so this was, out of this, the freedom agenda was born. And the idea was that exporting American values to the Middle East in particular, but elsewhere as well, would be a key tool to fight terrorism overseas. The most visible aspect of that policy in the Middle East was the Middle East Partnership Initiative, which was a really major focus of the Bush administration's policy in the Middle East that was launched in 2002. This was important in part because, again, it was this idea that we're going to change hearts and minds, we're going to bring American values to the Middle East, but also it's called the Middle East Partnership Initiative for a reason. The idea, the thinking behind this was that the United States would partner with Arab governments, and the word governments is important there too, in order to figure out how are you going to convince these Arab governments, convince these, in most cases, Arab autocrats, to have, let in a little more freedom, to liberalize in certain ways. And as I said, it was launched in 2002, which is also important. At the same time, this was coming right after the publication of the first Arab Human Development Report, which was a document that was written by Arabs that was addressing what they identified as a need to address knowledge, freedom, and women's empowerment. 3 areas that they saw as deficits within the Arab world. And so part of the idea behind the Middle East Partnership Initiative was you were going to use these same deficits that were already identified by actors in the region in order to change policy, in order to, in the end, improve US national security, but also in a way that's going to help Arab societies. Now, if you look at funding numbers, at the end of the Bush administration, programs that were classified as governing justly and democratically received more each year during the end of the Bush administration than during the entire 1991 to 2001 period combined. So for that 10-year period leading up to the attacks of 9/11, that whole 10-year period, the amount of funding that the US had been spending on this category of promoting democracy was the same as in each year under the end of the Bush administration. So this shows you that this was not only a sort of rhetorical commitment to democracy promotion, but there was a lot of money behind this, at least relatively a lot of money. And MEPI was a big part of that, the Middle East Partnership Initiative. MEPI's peak in fiscal year 2006 received $114.2 million, which is quite a bit when you're talking about democracy promotion money, which is not very expensive. You're not talking about, sort of hardware and military type of things. These are small programs that generally receive relatively small grants. However, so I'm trying to show you a little bit that Bush was very sincere in these efforts, but they suffered, and I would say they really kind of flamed out for a lot of reasons. First of all, one of the reasons that people in the region didn't really trust Bush's efforts or didn't believe that he was sincere is because while he was trying to promote democracy abroad, trying to promote democracy in the Arab world, he was also fanning the flames of Islamophobia at home. Again, this started right after September 11th, when there was a massive rise in Islamophobia in the United States. And so you had an administration that, a more generous interpretation could say they just were sort of ignoring this, but they also at the same time were, I would say, fanning the flames of this. And so it's easy to see why people would say, how can you be, you're letting this Islamophobia go on in your own country? How are you saying that we're here and that we should trust you to do what's right for us in our countries? The second reason why this didn't really succeed was that there were a series of electoral contests that took place during the time of the Bush administration in the region. And none of these have actually gone, or most of these didn't really go the way that the United States had wanted or anticipated. We saw this with the election of Hamas in Palestine, the success of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the success of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So you had multiple examples where in practice, what you should have seen was that the United States was warmly supporting these democratic victors. This idea that, people are actually out there doing what we want them to be doing. They're holding elections. Elections are one, not the only, but one major part of democracy. This is great. But in reality, what you saw was that the United States was really not happy with the results of these elections and gave a lukewarm, if not hostile, reaction to these elections, which again led to mistrust. Say, okay, well, you want democracy, but only if democracy looks a certain way. And another reason that this effort failed is that while President Bush was trying to promote democracy on the one hand, he was also very naive in what he let authoritarian states in the region get away with. So a lot of these guys, frankly, played Bush. You saw everyone from Saudi Arabia to Egypt to other places were basically taking really tiny steps towards liberalization, and they would win the approval of the United States. So there's multiple examples of speeches you can read from that time where you see Bush or other high-level Bush administration officials applauding really like heavy-handed autocrats in the region for doing very small things that clearly are not actually shifting the balance of power towards the people. But the biggest challenge to the Bush administration's efforts came during the Iraq War. So not only were there the horrific numbers of loss of life and the whole questionable, if not false start of the war in the first place, or reason for the war in the first place, but when you talk about democracy promotion, what matters here is that the Iraq War entailed forcible regime change. So you're out there supposedly promoting this idea that you're going to bring liberalization, that you're going to have democracy come about in a sort of authentic way, but then you're also in there starting a war and forcibly removing someone from power. So this is something that really upset people across the globe, but particularly people of the Middle East who just frankly didn't trust Bush. And what we saw then at the end of the Bush administration is that people in the region on the one hand really wanted to live in a country that was governed democratically. So if you look at survey data from that time, there's really high numbers of people across the region who would report that if given a choice, they would prefer democracy over other forms of government in their own country. But at the same time, even higher numbers of people said that they viewed US democracy promotion efforts very poorly. So you can see that people wanted democracy, but not the way that Bush was doing it. So that brings us to the end of the Bush administration. Moving on to the Obama years, President Obama came into office really wanting to shake things up. And a big part of his initial foreign policy was wanting to restore US credibility across the globe, particularly in the Arab world, not just in the Arab world, but that was one of his main areas of focus at the beginning. On the one hand, he saw the damage that I have just talked about that Bush had done in the region, and he thought that he was going to come in, really show the people of the Arab world that he respected them, that he was willing to listen to them. But he also really thought that reducing US military and political investment in the Middle East was essential for US national security in the long run. He wanted to, again, restore credibility, but that to him looked like disengaging. And he laid out his vision in an address at the American University of Cairo on June 4th, 2009. And in this address, it was very important. This is where he was trying to really sell the United States back to the Middle East. He chose Cairo for a reason. And he laid out this idea that you're going to have a values-based foreign policy, but you're not going to impose democracy on others. And this was very important. Again, it echoed a lot of the same ideas that Bush had had. Both Obama and Bush very much believed in liberalization and freedom in promoting these ideas, but it was from a very different perspective. On the one hand, Obama also in his speech recognized the harm the United States had caused. So he was out there, he explicitly stated, that the US had done some really bad things, and he was there to reset relations with the governments and the people of the region. And this is another area where there was a big shift from Bush to Obama, was the desire and the need to work more with the Arab people. And here I'm talking about civil society organizations, young people, local actors. The Bush administration's approach was very much top down. This idea that, again, you were going to promote democracy through trying to convince Arab leaders that it's in their interest to make change. Obama saw it differently. This is not surprising. He got his start as a community organizer. His idea was you're going to come in and work with the top, but also with the bottom, that you're going to work with the local people, you're going to work with civil society in order to help get a more married approach between the top down and bottom up. But at the same time, one of the things that sort of hurt Obama, which is something that has that has been, it's not unique to him by any means, is that while he was trying to repair this relationship, he was also reaching out to autocratic governments that kind of upset people in the region. So one of the things that he did was his effort at reset with Russia, and in particular courting Iran's acceptance of the nuclear deal, which upset people in the region, particularly activists who thought that how could you be doing this and the one hand saying that you're on the side of freedom, not autocracy, but here you are cozying up to autocrats just like everyone else before you has done. So I think there was a lot of hope when Obama was elected. People in the region were very excited. Bush was, really hated throughout the region, and you had this person come in who they thought was going to actually make real change. But from the beginning, there was a little skepticism and this idea that, well, maybe this guy is just like every other person who's come before him. So as Obama was going forward, trying to disengage from the region, suddenly you had the Arab Spring. So the Arab Spring that began in Tunisia at the end of 2010, going through 2011, really took the United States and much of the world by surprise. Obama had wanted a really hands-off approach to the region, but he quickly came to see that the United States could not stand on the sidelines during the Arab Spring. Now, the United States was careful, and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was one of the people who was really involved in these decisions at the time. They were really, she and President Obama were very careful not to interfere, and I think in some cases they were too hands-off. But as time went on and the revolutions and popular uprisings started sweeping across the region, it became clear the United States had to do something. By standing on the sidelines, by not taking a position, they were in fact taking a position. So Obama gave a speech on May 19th of 2011, a couple of months after both the Egyptian and the Tunisian revolutions. And he made a couple of really important points here. And one thing he said was, quote, "America values the dignity of the street vendor in Tunisia more than the raw power of the dictator." And I think this is really important. This was something that people had not heard before. This idea that, okay, you accuse me of being on the side of some of these dictators, I'm done with that. The value of the street vendor is more important than the raw power of the dictator. That's really lofty rhetoric. That's exactly what people in the streets wanted to hear. We'll talk in a little bit about if that was followed up on. But the other thing that he said that I think is really crucial is, quote, "If you take the risks that reform entails, you will have the full support of the United States." And here, that term full support is really important. As time went on, and even in just the first kind of year or two after the Arab Spring began, many of the activists, many of the revolutionaries felt like the amount of diplomatic and financial support given to them was far from the, quote, full support that Obama had promised. And we can see this in actually the numbers of foreign assistance. So when you look at US foreign assistance to the region before and after the Arab Spring, there was certainly an uptick in funding to the region in the democracy promotion arena right after 2011. And one case that's sort of an anomaly here is Tunisia, where Tunisia was a country that the United States did not have much of a relationship with before the Arab Spring. Small, but did not give much foreign assistance. There weren't a lot of strong US national security interests there. Once the revolution happened, there was a massive influx of cash eventually to Tunisia. So you did see this big spike right after 2011. But if you sort of take that as one little anomaly, the amount of US foreign assistance to the region in the democracy promotion arena and writ large was relatively stable from before and after the Arab Spring. So from when you look at the end of the Obama administration, the beginning before the Arab Spring, you didn't see that full support, at least from financial perspective. Now, I want to add in here though, Obama's pre-Arab Spring budgets had actually doubled funding for democracy and governance programs over those of the Bush administration. So it's not like Bush had raised all this funding and the funding levels went way up and then Obama cut them down before the Arab Spring and then they stayed low. In fact, Obama had raised the amount of funding for democracy and governance significantly when he came into office. So there was some emphasis on that just then continued. Now, a lot of that money did go towards Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. But even if you look at just the kind of non-conflict countries, you will see that for the most part, the Obama administration maintained levels higher than the Bush administration and kept that relatively stable. You did not see this dramatic increase that would have been concomitant with his statement that he was actually going to give the full support to the people on the ground. And the reason for this is because President Obama, like everyone before him and after him, or maybe not after him, but struggled with the balance between interests and values. So this is, the perennial question in US foreign policy is, do you put more weight onto promoting American values, or do you put more weight onto promoting American interests? It's very rare to do just one and not the other. There's usually, the line is somewhere usually in the middle. And Obama really struggled with this. Now, in the case of Tunisia, where the United States had few interests prior to the Arab Spring, it was very easy to value the street vendor over the despot. Not a problem. The despot, first of all, he left, he got in a plane. It's kind of an easy case to handle. But then you look at other countries like Egypt, where the United States had a massive foreign assistance package before the Arab Spring, had strong ties, military ties, economic ties, or Syria, where you had and continue to have an active civil war. It's not so easy there for the United States to just decide it's going to value the street vendor over the despot. And we saw, particularly in the case of Egypt, when you had the 2013 coup against democratically elected President Mohamed Morsi, the United States failed to take a stand, failed to call it a coup. I was working in government at the time, and this was something that was just such a painful decision of what do you do? It was clear to a lot of people that by law it was a coup, but should the United States call it a coup, that would trigger all sorts of other legal implications, including reducing our aid, and the fear that if you reduced our aid, that would destroy the US-Egyptian relationship was very, very difficult for a lot of people in the US administration to handle. The same thing happened with Syria, which actually this was very similar timing, where President Assad actually crossed the red line of using chemical weapons against his own people. And President Obama had said this was going to be a red line, that should that happen, there would be a strong US reaction. There ended up being very little US reaction, in part because of the fear of what that would mean for US interests. So you can see that more often than not, actually, interest trumped values. And in the end, I think we can see Obama's foreign policy is relatively reactive. One of the reasons for this also, I should say, to talking back about the funding measures, is that there was a lot of challenges in how do you figure out how to fund this. The Arab Spring, again, was a surprise, was not a planned event. So there was no line item in the budget for the Arab Spring before it happened. And so it was really difficult for people to kind of figure out in the administration, where do we get money to actually fund this thing? The people who were really, really set on supporting the street vendors couldn't find the money to do it. They had to find reprogrammed money. There was no new funding stream initially. But what they did do, and I do want to give them a lot of credit for this, is they ended up adopting some measures that going forward have made funding a lot more flexible and responsive and agile. So while you can see that maybe funding is sort of like the big ship that's difficult to turn, today there are a lot of small things that happen that together have made it a lot easier to respond to things that happen. One of those is by transitioning funding to embassies rather than out of Washington headquarters. So this applies particularly to the Middle East Partnership Initiative, which still exists, that you make those funding decisions come out of the embassies, who are close to the people who are able to react right away to something, rather than having to wait for months, if not years, for some sort of bigger, broader initiative. The Obama administration was also very supportive and involved in the G8's broader Middle East and North Africa initiative, which was both a funding and convening mechanism to help address some of the challenges following the Arab Spring. They created the Civil Society 2.0 initiative, which built the technological capacity of grassroots CSOs, and then launched the Open Government Partnership, which is, again, still exists today and is set to help governments become more transparent, accountable, and responsive to their citizens. So while there's a lot of criticism of how the Obama administration handled the Arab Spring and how it really didn't live up to the lofty rhetoric that Obama said in May of 2011, they did adopt many important, maybe they're kind of boring bureaucratic mechanisms, but many important things that have made it much easier for the United States to actually respond to changes on the ground in a more agile way. There's still a lot of work that has to be done, but I will say that's an important thing. So then coming to the Trump administration, as I mentioned, Trump came to power with this explicitly America First policy. His foreign policy has been described as transactional. That is, it's interest-driven with little regard for the export of democratic values. I give you something, I get something back. There's not a lot of room there to promote values. And Trump has openly embraced the region's autocrats. He, called President Sisi of Egypt my favorite dictator. Not my favorite guy, my favorite dictator, acknowledging this guy's a dictator and he's my buddy. You also see this sort of fight between values and interests, but it's pretty black and white for the Trump administration. And if you look at some comments that were made by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, the first Secretary of State under this administration in 2017, he said something that was very instructive about how the administration views values. What he said was, quote, "Guiding all of our foreign policy actions are our fundamental values. Our values around freedom, human dignity, the way people are treated, those are our values. Those are not our policies." And then he goes on to say, quote, "If you condition our national security efforts on someone adopting our values, we probably can't achieve our national security goals or interests." So you really see here that we're working on the specific set of national security interests. The values just kind of get in the way. They're still our values, but we're not going to condition what we're doing on them. And so as a result, democracy promotion is no longer a part of US foreign policy, which is a massive change from the past. Now, MEPI still exists, there are still programs, there's still a funding stream for governing democratically and justly, but it's not a priority of the US administration for the first time in decades and decades. But I would argue that this worldview is actually detrimental to US national security interests. So first of all, the idea is that the administration is trying to support stability, trying to support things that are good for the United States, but that fails to recognize that actually improved governance brings improved stability. That when you have poor governance, when you have people that are frustrated, that actually leads to instability, not stability. Additionally, the Trump administration is very explicit in its focus on countering violent extremism, countering terrorism, but it also fails to recognize that extremist recruitment preys on the anger and frustration that comes out of a lack of good governance. When people don't have a voice, there is no accountability. These sorts of ideas are the things that feed right into the hands of extremist recruiters. So in fact, by saying we're not even going to focus on values, we're just kind of push through, we're going to be friends with who we need to be friends with just so we get what we need, you're feeding into the hands of your enemies. You're actually doing something that's explicitly detrimental to US national security. And I would say that pretty much all US interests, whether it's stability of the global energy market, promotion of economic growth, or regional security, all of these would actually be assisted with some explicit support for greater freedom in the region. Not necessarily full-fledged democracy promotion, certainly not regime change, but at least support for freedom or recognizing the role of the people and trying to fix the governance challenges that are there, or work with the people to fix the governance challenges that are there. So where are we today? So I think all of us, we just need to look around ourselves to realize that really little outside of health concerns are what's occupying the US administration today, and I think for a very good reason. However, I do want to flag, this has kind of been lost, I think, in the press, but the United States has been providing significant funding to the Middle East and as well as the rest of the world for the COVID-19 efforts. So it's not that we've kind of forgotten about the Middle East, that we're only focused on ourselves. The United States has actually been providing lots of money to the various countries of the region, but it's for humanitarian issues, for health issues. It's not for some of these other kind of governance issues that I was talking about. And I would argue that by focusing so narrowly on these health issues, we're actually missing some threats to democracy that are going on right under our noses. And I actually have a piece coming out, I think tomorrow, that's looking at the pushback on freedom of expression in the region that has been taking place while they're fighting the COVID outbreak. And what we've seen is that while, across the globe, including in the United States, people are mostly willing to put up with limits to their own civil liberties. This is something, at least for now, people have accepted that it's something that we're just going to have to do. It's for the better good of everyone if we just accept that our civil liberties are limited. That's the same thing in the region. But what we're seeing at the same time is that governments are smart and they've taken advantage of this situation to further crack down on dissent. So it's kind of become carte blanche for them to issue any sort of crackdown. So while there's one thing where you can say people should stay at their homes, people need to be 6 feet apart, wear masks when you're outside, is another thing to say you can't be critical of the regime on Facebook or we're going to arrest you. And that's what's actually happening right now. To give one example, Morocco put in a state of emergency on March 20th. And since then, 50,000 Moroccans, in just about a month, 50,000 Moroccans have been arrested for violating that state of emergency. Now, some of these are people who are flaunting the state of emergency, but a lot of these, or at least a good proportion of them, are actually people who are being arrested for freedom of expression type issues. We've seen the Algerian and the Lebanese protests ground to a halt. Again, this makes sense. You're not going to allow protests when you're trying to make sure everyone is 6 feet apart. It's very difficult to do that. You want people to stay home. That makes sense. But the way that this was done, there's a clear sense that it's also trying to silence dissent. And because you can no longer arrest people for being out in the street because they're not out in the street, we've seen a massive uptick in arrests of people online for dissent, particularly on social media. People who are being arrested for speaking out that probably wouldn't have been speaking out on Facebook that probably wouldn't have been arrested before. And we've also seen civil society and the media hobbled by the extreme lockdowns, making it virtually impossible for them to do the kind of research they need to do, on the ground research, the sort of activism that they need. So you've seen this real challenge. Again, this is not unique to the Arab world. This is all over the world. But what you were already at this really sort of important inflection point where you had a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, where you had people in many countries in the region. Now they've had to take that online. And we also are lacking some of the information we would have had about that because people can't go out and report on it in the way they could before. But the region also faces this kind of double whammy of the COVID-19 measures and the massive decline in oil prices. You know, many countries in the region are run-tier economies. This incredible decline of oil has had a tremendous economic impact on countries in the region. And so what you're seeing is this combination of a really severe economic hit plus popular frustration with the way that the crisis is being handled, and the popular frustration that was there before, which is setting up conditions for mass unrest. So I don't want to speculate too much on what's going to happen in the region, as you know, the world is really changing in front of our eyes every day. But I do think we're going to see continued opposition to authoritarianism. And while the region's autocrats may be able to tamp down freedom and liberalization for now, this is not going to last forever. All the conditions that we saw both before the COVID-19 outbreak and today make the region ripe for another Arab Spring. So finally, just a few quick thoughts on US policy in the future. First, I'll just talk a little about what we might see if there is a change in administration, if Vice President Biden were to be elected in January or in November, take office in January, and then what might happen if we see continued Trump administration. So I think, should you see a change in administration, I would expect to see a massive shift away from cozying up to the autocrats and a reintroduction of values into US foreign policy. Now, that doesn't mean you would see a total embrace of democracy promotion. I think there is some skepticism about that still, but you will see a return to the acknowledgement that supporting freedom abroad is in the US national security interest. You will also be operating, though, under an extremely challenging budget environment. We all see this. I think many of us feel this in our own lives. So I don't expect that we would see any sort of massive financial investment in democracy promotion or in civil society, but most likely you'll see continued humanitarian support, as I mentioned before. That said, diplomatic support for freedom and human rights is cheap, if not free. Giving a speech doesn't cost a cent. And there's a lot the next US administration can do to show its support for activists in the region and those supporting more liberalization. And I would expect to see some sort of, similar to the Cairo speech Obama gave when he took office, something to say, look, we are here for you, we understand you, we want to support you, speaking directly to the people of the region. And arguably as important is that I think we'll see a dramatic increase in the support of democracy at home, should there be a change in administration. The Trump administration has hurt the region's activists by ignoring them, but also by allowing threats to US democracy to grow. And so one of the things we've seen is that people, really have no one supporting them anymore. There's no sort of massive global voice from the United States saying that we support you. I haven't talked all about Europe. I'm not going to, out of an interest of time. Europe is still there, and Europe, and particularly a couple of countries like Sweden, Germany, others have really taken up the mantle of key democracy promoters. And I think, what we would see from a Biden administration is that it would likely try to reverse much of Trump's assault on US democracy by restoring public trust in US institutions and the media and the like. But if we are to see a second Trump administration, which is a real possibility, I expect that we'll see even a more full-throated support for autocrats like Sisi, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, and little hope for the region's Democrats. And I hate to close on such a pessimistic note, but I think we'd even be likely to see more domestic power grabs and no-holds-barred assault on US democracy, which would be bad for Americans, but also very horrible for the people of the region. And again, sorry to end it on such a terrible note, but I'm going to close there.